Are we recording? Everyone's good? Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming on today and to all of those online. So we're very pleased today at the Scottish Aesthetics Forum to be welcoming Professor Catharine Abell, who is Professor of Philosophy of Art at Queen's College, Oxford. Catharine's work in philosophy of art intersects with philosophy of language and philosophy of mind, and in the past she's worked on depiction, fiction, and today she's going to be talking to us about experience, the role of experience in appreciating art. So, Catharine will talk for roughly the first hour, or perhaps slightly less.
Maybe a bit less.
Okay. And then we'll have a very short break, and we'll then go to Q&A. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Catharine and Lisa, for inviting me to give this talk. Pleasure to be here. So for people online, there's a handout I think that's been posted in the chat, and I'm just going to follow along with that and show you some pictures on PowerPoint as I go along. So the issue I want to discuss today is that of what the epistemic requirements for appreciating an artwork are. Now, I think it would be very difficult to identify epistemic conditions that were sufficient for appreciating an artwork, because I don't think there are all kinds of things that could derail appreciation. So inattention, arguably lack of taste, all kinds of ways in which it can go wrong. So on the other hand, you might think it's too easy to identify necessary conditions for appreciating an artwork. So what I'm going to aim to identify are some necessary conditions for appreciation that are interesting and informative rather than, you know, obvious and uninformative. So it's important first to distinguish appreciation from judgment. So we can judge that an artwork is good or is beautiful, but this does not suffice for appreciation. Appreciation has an experiential dimension that judgment does not. So I think the judgment is a prerequisite for appreciation. So the quote from Livingstone brings out this difference. He says, "It is one thing to have good grounds to think a work of art graceful, exciting, funny, and such. It's something else to gauge, appraise, or actively appreciate it as being so, thereby experiencing and in effect partaking of the state of affairs in which its inherent value, that is, its contemplative or aesthetic experiential value, is instantiated." So I'm concerned with identifying epistemic requirements for appreciation, not merely for judgment. So many philosophers argue that aesthetic judgments require first-hand experience of their objects. So very famously, Walheim identifies what's known as the acquaintance principle. He says, judgments of aesthetic value must be based on first-hand experience of their objects and are not, except within very narrow limits, transmissible from one person to another. So here, Walheim seems to be claiming that it is not possible for testimony to provide knowledge that an artwork is beautiful or knowledge that an artwork is good. So he's concerned with the impermissibility of aesthetic testimony. But there's a different kind of concern that one might have here, evident in the following quote from Sibley, who says, "We have to read the poem, hear the music, or see the picture, not merely have it described in non-merit and even determinative descriptive terms, if that were possible, and then judge or decide whether an aesthetic merit term applies to it or not." So Sibley's not concerned with whether I can come to know that an artwork is good because Lisa tells me that it's good. because here the descriptions that he's concerned with are just describing the non-merit descriptions of works in non-merit terms. So he's rather concerned with the absence of principles specifying non-aesthetic properties sufficient for the possession of some aesthetic property. So he thinks no matter what we know about a work's non-aesthetic properties, that knowledge, unless we see the artwork for ourselves, can never enable us to come to know that it has some aesthetic property. Now, you might disagree with Wollheim about the impermissibility of aesthetic testimony. So I think I could come to know that an artwork is beautiful because Lisa tells me it is, and I know enough about Lisa to have good grounds to think that she's right about these matters. But even if you think that, you might still think that the acquaintance principle holds for aesthetic appreciation rather than just for aesthetic judgment. And this seems to be what Budd thinks. He says, appreciation of a work is not a matter of knowing what its aesthetic properties are, but of perceiving them as realized in the work. So you do not appreciate a work even if you know it secondhand as full of characterization of its aesthetic properties as might be given by one who is perceiving the work. And attitudes and reactions linked to appreciation, liking or disliking, admiration, contempt, revulsion, and so on, are denied to you. You cannot like a work's gracefulness if you are unacquainted with the work. So I might know that a work is graceful and yet fail to appreciate its gracefulness because I have not perceived its gracefulness realized in the work. And one might also think that it's plausible that a full characterization of a work's non-aesthetic properties cannot enable appreciation. Now, there is a problem here in the claim that first-hand experience of an artwork is necessary for appreciation, in that we can often appreciate works, at least maybe partially or incompletely, but at least partially or incompletely by seeing reproductions of them. So here I am showing you in really non-optimal conditions an image of Titian's Venus of Urbino, and arguably it's possible for you to at least partially appreciate the work by looking at this reproduction of it. So some people think we need to modify the acquaintance principle to allow first-hand experience of a reproduction or some other kind of surrogate to support appreciation. So the modified acquaintance principle has it that the aesthetic appreciation of an artwork must be based on first-hand experience, either of that artwork or of an adequate surrogate for it. Now, of course, this raises the question of what constitutes an adequate surrogate. That's something I hope to come back to later in the paper. But my real concern in this paper is to address counterexamples to this modified acquaintance principle that arise no matter how we understand what it is for something to be an adequate surrogate. And the problem arises because there's reason to doubt the necessity of first-hand experience of either artworks or their surrogates for the appreciation of at least some artworks. Importantly, there are some artworks, descriptions of which seem to enable appreciation. So one of the examples commonly given is Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing. So this is what it looks like. You don't seem to need to have a first-hand experience of it, though, to appreciate it. What you need to know is that Rauschenberg bought a de Kooning drawing and then painstakingly erased it. And maybe there's a lot else that you need to know about de Kooning's role, status in the art world at that time, about the art historical context in which Rauschenberg did this, but my description probably doesn't enable you to appreciate the artwork. But the important point is it seems like some description could. And similarly, you might think that it's not necessary to have a first-hand experience of Duchamp's fountain in order to, or of a reproduction of it, in order to experience it. If I tell you enough about fountain that Duchamp submitted to the inaugural exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in 1917, that it comprises an ordinary urinal with the signature Mutt written on the side, and so on and so forth, it seems that would be enough to enable you to appreciate the artwork. And I'll just give you some more examples. Another example is by an American artist called Walter de Maria. He made an artwork, Vertical Earth Kilometer, which consists in a 5 centimeter wide brass rod that's a kilometer long, inserted into the earth, into a hole that was painstakingly drilled. And so this is all you can see when you look at it. And just having this experience does not seem necessary to appreciating the work. Another is Manzoni's Socle du Monde, the plinth of the earth, which is an upside down plinth stuck on the earth, which it seems presents the earth itself as an artwork to be appreciated. But obviously, we don't need to see the earth as a whole. We can appreciate it without doing that. Duchamp's LHOQ, which consists in a reproduction of the Mona Lisa with a moustache and a goatee beard added, and the letters LHOQ written underneath. If you know enough about French to know what that acronym sounds like when pronounced in the way French people would pronounce it, you seem to be in a position to appreciate the work. And when I show you a reproduction of it, it doesn't seem to do anything to enhance or enable appreciation that my description could not. And similarly, if I tell you that LHOQ rasé is just an image of the Mona Lisa with no beard and no moustache added, you seem able to appreciate that without having first-hand experience either of the work or of a surrogate for it. Now, you might not like all of these examples. The particular examples don't matter so long as you see the general way, which is that there are going to be some artworks we can appreciate on the basis of descriptions. So the cases like these seem to provide counterexamples to the modified acquaintance principle. Now, an adequate epistemology of art appreciation, I think, needs to do several things. Firstly, I think we want to be able to explain why first-hand experience of some artworks does seem essential to the appreciation of them, while it's not essential to the appreciation of others. It would also be, we would like an epistemology of art appreciation to explain what makes a reproduction an adequate surrogate, such that first-hand experience of that reproduction can enable appreciation. And likewise, what features a description must have, a description of an artwork must have in order to enable us to appreciate that artwork. So ultimately, my hope is to provide an alternative to the modified acquaintance principle. But before I do that, I just want to discuss two attempts to reconcile these examples, these cases I've just given you, with that modified acquaintance principle. So one way of trying to rescue the principle would be to point out the fact that it concerns aesthetic appreciation. So the modified acquaintance principle claims only that the aesthetic appreciation of an artwork must be based on first-hand experience, either of it or of an adequate surrogate. But you might think that artworks of the kinds I've just described, those that descriptions seem capable of enabling us to appreciate, are not artworks that we appreciate aesthetically. So this is Timothy Binkley's line. He says, yeah, there are some works that that descriptions can enable us to appreciate, but those are not aesthetic works. The appreciation of those works is not aesthetic. And I think there are two problems with this maneuver. So one is that many of the properties we ascribe to works such as these seem aesthetic. So Socle du Monde is ingenious, Fountain is witty. These seem like aesthetic descriptions of these works. But even if that were not the case, as Louise Hanson points out, the requirement for first-hand experience of an artwork for appreciating that artwork is often put forward as a general art critical principle, not as a claim that's limited to aesthetic appreciation. So arguing that the appreciation of these works is not aesthetic is not going to persuade someone who endorses the modified acquaintance principle as a general art critical principle that there is nothing wrong, that these works aren't counterexamples to it. So my task today is not to decide whether appreciation of these works is aesthetic or not. I want to remain neutral regarding whether appreciating them is aesthetic. We engage in genuinely aesthetic appreciation when we appreciate works like these. So henceforth, I'm going to talk of artistic appreciation and artistic properties, and I just want to remain neutral regarding the relation between artistic appreciation and aesthetic appreciation, and between artistic properties and aesthetic properties. So maybe they'll turn out to be the same things, maybe they won't. I don't want to commit myself one way or another about that. Okay, so I don't think that distinguishing aesthetic from artistic appreciation and limiting the modified acquaintance principle to aesthetic appreciation is a good way to go. Another way to go would be to distinguish between first-hand experience and acquaintance more generally. So some artworks are simply not perceptible at all. So one example is a series of works by Robert Barry called Inert Gas series, in which he released colourless, odourless gases into the landscape around LA and allowed them to disperse. So what I'm showing you here is a photograph taken at the time of this event, but it's not, the photograph is not the artwork. the artwork is an imperceptible event. And another example is another work by Robert Barry, All the Things I Know, but of which I am not at the moment thinking. So here we have the words written down, but you know, the inscription of the words is not the work. It's a good question what the work is, but it's not perceptible, is the thought. Now, given that some artworks are simply not perceptible, first-hand experience simply cannot play the role in the appreciation of such works that is ascribed to it, that the modified acquaintance principle ascribes to it in the case of perceptible works. Now, we've got other problem cases in the vicinity here. So literature also seems to pose a problem. Normally, when we appreciate literature, there is something perceptible we are appreciating. We're either hearing words or seeing words, but it seems perfectly possible to compose a short poem in one's head and to appreciate it without it ever having been externalized at all. So if what we're after, if the modified acquaintance principle is to have the status of a general art critical principle, it has to be taken, it can't be taken literally in the way that's stated on the handout. So maybe the way we should be construing this principle appeals to acquaintance rather than first-hand experience. So the idea is that first-hand experience is arguably necessary for the appreciation of many artworks because first-hand experience alone can acquaint us with those works, where acquaintance is a direct, non-inferential way of obtaining knowledge of an artwork. But if we're going to accommodate non-perceptible artworks and works of literature composed and kept in the head, we should construe the general art critical principle as claiming that what's necessary for appreciation is acquaintance with the work. And acquaintance is often had by means of first-hand experience. But in the case of imperceptible works, the idea is that acquaintance might be had in some other way. So Louise Hanson discusses the idea, without endorsing, the idea that an artwork's ontology might have implications for what it is to be acquainted with the work. So Peter Goldie and Elizabeth Shellikens wrote a book arguing that conceptual artworks are ideas. That's an ontological claim. Now, if all the apparent counterexamples to the modified acquaintance principle that I've given you are ideas, maybe the reason that descriptions can enable us to appreciate those works is that descriptions can acquaint us with ideas by directly expressing those ideas. And if that were the case, it would seem that really, properly understood, the principle doesn't, these cases aren't counterexamples to the principle at all. Now, I agree with Hanson that this ontological claim is implausible. I think it's implausible that these artworks are ideas. Different artworks could express the same idea, but be different artworks because the manner in which they do so is different. But more generally, I don't think ontology can play the role that this argument ascribes to it. So think about repeatable artworks. First-hand experience is generally taken to be necessary for the appreciation of works of music, past sculptures, etchings, and so on. But what we have first-hand experience in these cases is not the works themselves, it's just instances of those works. And indeed, works of music are often held to be of ontological kinds where it's not clear how we could be acquainted with the kinds themselves. So if works of music are Platonic types, it's really not clear that they're the kinds of things with which we could be acquainted. So I don't think that ontology is the way to go here. So what I would like is to propose an alternative. I think that the counterexamples show that we are genuine counterexamples. If you don't know my particular cases, I think it's possible to think of others. We need to reject the modified acquaintance principle. The question is, what should we replace it with? And the first thing that I would like to note is that what we really need to be acquainted with to appreciate an artwork is not the artwork itself. So consider Bernini's sculpture, Daphne and Apollo. If one were to see it in the Villa Borghese from this vantage point, you wouldn't yet be in a position to appreciate it because you need to walk around it. Right? So simply seeing the work doesn't enable appreciation. Of course, the obvious response to this is haven't yet seen all of the work when I just look at it from a particular vantage point. But notice that in the case of paintings, seeing all of the work doesn't matter. I don't have to inspect the back of a canvas to be acquainted, or I don't have to have first-hand experience of the back of a painting in order to appreciate it. So really, what matters for appreciation is acquaintance with the right sorts of features or the right sorts of properties. Which properties? Well, the properties that the non-artistic properties of an artwork that determine its artistic properties. So in the case of the Bernini sculpture, I have to walk all around the sculpture to appreciate it because its three-dimensional shape matters to my appreciation of it. In the case of the painting, I don't have to look at the back of the painting because the three-dimensional shape of the painting doesn't matter. It doesn't help to determine the artistic properties of the painting. All that matters is the marked surface. The features of the marked surface are what I need to be acquainted with. And so I think the contrast between pictures and paintings and sculptures shows us that different artworks, different non-artistic properties of different artworks determine their artistic properties. There's variability here. And I don't think the variability is just on the gross level of three-dimensional shape matters for sculpture but doesn't matter for painting. I think even within a particular art form, there is going to be some variability. So I think the non-artistic properties on which a work's artistic properties depend can be more or less abstract. So consider a contrast between Rembrandt's The Jewish Bride, where the artistic properties of the work depend on really fine details of the ways in which the hands are painted. So really fine-grained determinate shape and colour properties, and compare that, say, with a collage by Matisse. I don't know how to get rid of that thing, I'm afraid.
It's not showing up online.
Oh, it's not. Okay, don't worry about it then. Oh. Ah, thank you. Thanks. So a collage by Matisse, the same sort of determinate colours and shapes just aren't relevant in the same way as they are with the Rembrandt. Okay, so I think there's variability, more variability there than one might originally think. And notice also that the properties of an artwork on which the non-artistic properties of an artwork on which its artistic properties depend are not solely perceptible properties. So the history of presentation of Duchamp's fountain matters to determining its artistic properties. This is true of all the cases I've offered as counterexamples to the modified acquaintance principle, but it's also true of many works for which that principle seems plausible. So I think the artistic properties of, for example, Picasso's Guernica depend partly on non-perceptible properties of the work, such as the fact that it was painted by a Spaniard in the immediate aftermath of the bombing of the town of Guernica by the Nazis. So I want to offer what I've called on the handout the new acquaintance principle. And the claim is that the appreciation of an artwork requires acquaintance with those of its non-artistic properties on which its artistic properties depend. Of course, that doesn't tell us which the relevant properties are in any given case. That's not my aim. But whatever they are, those are the ones that you need to be acquainted with. So for something to acquaint us with a property, a given property of an artwork, is for it to provide us with direct, non-inferential knowledge of that property. So to be acquainted with the property is for that property to be immediately before one's mind, or readily brought before one's mind. Now, one interesting consequence of distinguishing between acquaintance with properties of works and acquaintance with works themselves is that something can acquaint us with a property of a work, even if it can't acquaint us with the fact that a work has a property. So a description might acquaint us with the property a work has of having been painted by Picasso. It brings immediately before one's mind that property of the work. But it doesn't follow from this that it can acquaint us with the fact that the artwork has that property, right? So I might need to see Picasso in action painting the work to be acquainted with the fact. Maybe I read it on good authority in an art history book, and that's how I come to know that fact. But there I'm relying on inference about the reliability of the testimony. And so that's inferential knowledge. Okay, so I think it's possible to have knowledge of a property without being acquainted with the property. So consider a case in which I describe to you a complex geometrical shape. You know, and I say, well, there's a circle, and then 1/5 of the radius of that, a section of 1/5 of the radius of that circle is intersected by another circle, and there's another circle, blah, blah, blah. And I might describe it to you in such a way that you are then able to mathematically compute certain properties, certain other features of that shape. Now, it seems fair to say there that you have knowledge of that shape property without being acquainted with that shape property. You're unable to bring that shape property immediately before your mind. Similarly, with non-perceptible properties. So, an art history student might know exactly what Manet's Olympia looks like, what Titian's Venus of Urbino looks like, the ways in which they differ, their chronological ordering and stuff. And yet not be acquainted with just how Olympia is related, in how the properties of Olympia relate to those of Titian, Venus of Urbino. What is the people who went to see the exhibition in which Manet's Olympia was originally presented, who were well versed or very familiar with the practice of nude up to that point, were acquainted with its location in art history in a way that the theoretician of art history need not be. That's a slightly shaky example. So if anyone can think of a better one, or a reason why non-perceptible properties can't be, we can't have acquaintance with them, I'd be interested in discussing it. Okay, so descriptions, I think, can acquaint us with some perceptible and some non-perceptible properties. So I think I can acquaint you with the shape of an object just by saying it's spherical. That description brings the relevant shape property immediately before your mind. Or something that is an equilateral triangle. Okay, so descriptions can acquaint us with perceptible properties, and they can also acquaint us with non-perceptible properties. Now, what properties a given description can acquaint one with isn't just up to the description. It's going to depend on our own background knowledge and our own cognitive capacities. Maybe there are shapes that you can visualize that I can't visualize, and maybe a description can therefore acquaint you with those properties, but not me. So the ability of a description to acquaint one with a set of properties is going to be relative to the individuals. And moreover, there may be some properties with which no description can acquaint anyone. And this is likely to be due to facts about the limits of natural languages, facts about the general human ability to process and retain information, and so on. So the claim is not that there are some artworks such that descriptions can always acquaint us with them, but the thought is that the counter examples rather to the modified acquaintance principle are all cases where there are at least some people for whom descriptions can acquaint them with those properties of those artworks on which their artistic properties depend. So I said at the beginning of my talk that an epistemology of art appreciation should tell us something about the conditions under which a reproduction is an adequate surrogate for an artwork, what properties a description needs to have to acquaint us with the work, and why first-hand experience is necessary for the appreciation of some artworks but not others. Well, adequate surrogates, on the account I've offered, an adequate surrogate for an artwork acquaints us with those of its non-artistic properties on which its artistic properties depend. Now, to the extent that appreciation of a work depends on some non-perceptible properties, a mere image is never going to be a completely adequate surrogate for it. And so for a description to acquaint us with an artwork, to enable us to appreciate an artwork, it must be an adequate surrogate. It must acquaint us with the non-artistic properties on which the artwork's artistic properties depend. And it's going to have better luck with acquainting us with the non-perceptible properties than an image. Why is first-hand experience necessary for the appreciation of some artworks but not others? Well, because the artistic properties of some artworks are determined by non-artistic properties with which no description could equate one. Only a first-hand experience will do this. So, just to finish off, so the new acquaintance principle allows a role for inference in acquainting one with an artwork's non-artistic properties, whether those properties are perceptible or not. Now, you might worry that this is incompatible with appreciation being aesthetic, and I said I wanted to remain neutral regarding whether or not appreciation is aesthetic. But notice that this is entirely consistent with the step from acquaintance with a work's non-artistic properties to appreciation of its artistic properties being necessarily non-inferential in the way that Sibley is concerned to argue that it is. So while the account I've offered you is incompatible with the view that aesthetic appreciation necessarily involves perceptual experience, it is compatible with the view that aesthetic properties must strike us rather than being inferred. And this is the sense in which people like James Shelley argue that perception is implicated in aesthetic appreciation. So the experience of acquaintance with those of an artwork's non-artistic properties on which its artistic properties depend, that is the experience that is essential to the appreciation of an artwork. I don't think it's the case that perceptual experience of an artwork or of a surrogate for it is always essential. Thank you.